Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming this Ramadan evening. I'm Maria Daycake. I'm Associate Professor of Religious Studies at George Mason and also Interim Director for the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies. And on behalf of the center, I want to welcome you all here tonight. We're so pleased to have our speaker, Dr. Oludamini Ogunnaike, with us this evening, and I will introduce him in a moment. But first, let me just say a few words about the center. The Center for Global Islamic Studies has been part of George Mason University since 2009 and was recently renamed the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies last summer in honor of Dr. Abdulhamid Abu Suleiman. The center's work is focused on advancing the public knowledge and understanding of Islam and Muslim history, peoples, and societies, on promoting and supporting high-level research in the interdisciplinary field of Islamic studies, and supporting younger scholars and graduate students who are pursuing study in this field. The center also operates a digital platform, publishing platform, Madīḥ, which you can find at themadīḥ.com, where we publish short articles, videos, podcasts on Islamic studies. You can find out more about the center by picking up some of the literature outside. We have a brochure and also some flyers about upcoming events, and of course you can also speak with me this evening. As you know, for Muslims, this is the month of Ramadan, in which Muslims believe that the Quran was first revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. It is therefore a sacred and special month marked by many religious and charitable activities, devotional reading of the Quran, extra prayers, charity of various kinds, all throughout the month. And of course, also most notably, a month-long fast, during which Muslims abstain from food and drink from dawn until sunset. Around here, that makes for anywhere between a 12 and 16-hour fast, so that's some intermittent fasting for you. But it's important to recognize as well that Ramadan and the fasting in Ramadan is meant as a celebration. It's not primarily meant in a penitent way, although one refocuses one's attention on spiritual matters, but nonetheless, it is a celebration. And in the Islamic world, during the month of Ramadan, cities are lit up. It's a time of celebration and of joy. And at the end of every day of fasting, at sunset, Muslims break their fast with a meal called iftar, literally breakfast or break fast. And this meal is ideally shared with friends and family as much as possible. So tonight we're happy to be able to share this meal with all of you. During the year, not just during Ramadan, sunset also is one of the 5 times of prayer, or salat, for Muslims. And Muslims typically pray this prayer just before breaking their fast. So to accommodate those who want to pray, the next room down, room 1202, has been set up to accommodate those who want to pray. The time for sunset this evening is 7:27. So we will try, or 7:28, I think I was told. So we will try to wrap up the talk and the question and answer roughly around 7:20, 7:25. Allow people an opportunity to pray for those who want to pray, and then we will begin serving the food shortly after that. So I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker. Dr. Ogunnaike is Associate Professor of African Religious Thought and Democracy. His research examines the philosophical and artistic dimensions of post-colonial, colonial, and pre-colonial Islamic and indigenous religious traditions of West and North Africa, especially Sufism and Ifa. His work is focused on the intellectual history and literary studies of the Islamic and indigenous traditions of West Africa. He is the author of Deep Knowledge, Ways of Knowing in Sufism and Ifa, Two West African Intellectual Traditions, published by Penn State University Press in 2020, which won the Outstanding First Book Prize for the Association for the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora. And Poetry in Praise of Prophetic Perfection, West African Madīḥ poetry and its precedents, which of course is what he will be speaking with us about tonight about. He is also currently working on a project on Sufi poetry and poetic knowledge, as well as manuscripts on Yoruba mythology, Islamic philosophy in pre-colonial West Africa, and Afro-Caribbean and African Islamic decolonial thought and praxis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ogunnaike.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Professor Dekake, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone here at George Mason University, Aisha, and everybody for setting up the wonderful dinner and iftar for us. And thank you to all of you. I see a lot of friends, colleagues, and students who traveled far to come hear this talk. I get very excited when I speak about Madīḥ poetry, so I'll try to wrap it up so I don't stand in the way of you and your food, particularly those of you who are fasting. So I'm going to talk about Madīḥ poetry, which is a particular genre of poetry. It's poetry written in praise of the Prophet Muhammad in West Africa. But to set the stage a little bit, West Africa is unique for a lot of things. But when it comes to Islam in West Africa, it's, at least in the contemporary periods, it's unique for kind of one feature stands out that makes it unique, not just our clothes, but the fact that the Pew Charitable Trust did a study in 2014, and they found that of all the different regions in the Muslim world, Sufism was by far more popular in West Africa than anywhere else in the world, not even close. So in their study of Muslims, 92% of Senegalese Muslims reported belonging to a Sufi order. Chad is about 55%, Nigeria, Ghana is about 37%. And these are not small countries. Nigeria has over 200 million people, half of whom are Muslims. All right, so there are more Muslims in Nigeria than in Egypt, more Muslims in Ethiopia than in Iraq. These are big Muslim centers, and these are big centers of Sufism. So we're talking about Islam in West Africa. Sufism is central. It's not an over here kind of mystical, weird sect of people doing things. It's just what Islam is. And if you're talking about contemporary Sufism, West Africa is very central. And this is largely due to the efforts of the people who you see pictured here. These are some of the great Sufi masters of the past 2 centuries in West Africa, particularly the work of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, you see pictured here, who was Senegalese, but traveled all throughout West Africa, really all throughout the world. And his order, a branch of the Tijaniya order, is really, really popular throughout all of West Africa. All of these figures that you see here, these great Sufi masters, were all great poets. And it's in large part due to their poetry that Sufism spread and became so dominant in West Africa. And the vast bulk of their poetry, their writings were dedicated to poetry in praise of the Prophet, which is what we're going to speak about this evening. So, what does it look like if you're in a place with 92% Sufis? Like this. So this is on a street in Senegal, in Kaolack. It's a guy who's selling shoes in the street, and he's trading verses with this guy on the roof from a famous Maulid poem, a poem celebrating the birth of the Prophet by Sheikh Ibrahim Niass. And this poetry is in Arabic, in classical Arabic. Sometimes these gatherings are at homes. This is in Chad. من مثله لذوي الكبائر يشفع من مثله بالمؤمنين رحيما أوليس هادينا إلى سبل الهدى أوليس منقذنا بنشرات الردى أوليس أكرم من تأمم وارتدى أولم يكن أزكى البرية خيما صلوا على. So you have gatherings like that in homes, informal. Sometimes there are more formal gatherings. This is in Senegal. This is from Sheikh Amadou Bamba's Tariqa, reciting some of his poetry. Moving over to Nigeria, this is a Maulid celebration. They're reciting the poetry of Sheikh Ibrahim Yes. It's not just a men's event. These are some women in Mauritania as well, reciting some of Sheikh Ibrahim Yas's poetry. Nigeria as well.
Because you are here to praise Muhammad Rasulullah.
Sorry, I'll just keep going listening to the rest of that. Even if you don't understand all the Arabic, it's really powerful. It's very moving. It's going back to Chad again too. This is a semi-formal gathering on the streets, reciting more of Sheikh Ibrahim Yas's poetry. This poem is about the collapse of the Iwan of Khusro's that happened at the birth of the Prophet. Back to Nigeria again. We have these guys in kind of a poetry competition.
رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حبيب الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رسول الله أحمد فوقنا إذا سألته خير لم ينعم يزا بديع السكايا فوق فضل
And he's getting some money sprayed on him. Alright, so it's a lot of fun too. This is a naming ceremony in Senegal, where again they're reciting this Madīḥ poetry. So in most West African Muslim societies, this poetry literally accompanies you from the cradle to the grave. It's just an integral part of social fabric and life. But despite its kind of ubiquity, it's everywhere, it hasn't really been studied much, at least in Europhone academic literature. And this is due to a couple of reasons. One is this myth of Islam noir, which has meant that kind of Islam in Africa has fallen between the cracks between African studies and Islamic studies. So to give you an example of this, when I was a graduate student, I was trying to order a book in Arabic that was published in Senegal. And I went to the Middle East Studies, the Arabic collections people, and they said, oh, we don't do Africa, go to African Studies people. And with the African Studies people, they said, well, we don't do, they said we don't do Africa. The African Studies people said, we don't do Arabic, go to Middle Eastern Studies people. Right, so the way in which the world was divided up, Islam and Muslims in Africa, despite being massive in number, and Islam being older in Africa than most of the Arabian Peninsula, kind of fell through the cracks. And this had a lot to do with this myth of Islam noir, which is that Arab culture or Persian culture plus Islam is just Islam. But African cultures plus Islam is some weird kind of syncretism thing. That Islam and Africa are two separate things, and when they come together, you get something weird. And this created these colonial categories in people's minds and in disciplines and on maps, separating North Africa from Southern Africa. When in fact the Sahara Desert functions a lot like the Indian Ocean. It's its own cultural zone, and places on either end of the Sahara Desert have a lot more in common culturally than they do with places even a little bit to the north of them or to the south of them. So if I go to the southern Sahara Desert in Morocco or Libya or something like that, they're wearing similar clothes, they're reciting similar poetry, they're eating similar food as they are on the south side of the Sahara Desert. It actually brings those areas closer together. Moreover, when studying Muslim societies, and particularly literary and religious and intellectual traditions, isnad, that is chain of transmission, matters a lot more than race or even geography. So West Africa, although geographically it's on the periphery of the Muslim world, in terms of chains of transmission for things like Madīḥ or other studies, other Islamic disciplines, is just as far away from the first Muslim community as contemporary Muslim communities in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. Right? There's the same number of chains in hadith transmission or other transmission of how you pray or do other things in Muslim societies in West Africa as there are ones in Saudi Arabia. So it's not necessarily at the periphery, but this is how it's often been seen, particularly in the colonial imagination. Another reason why this kind of praise poetry hasn't been studied much, is that people who study African literature just study Europhone literature, generally. So if you say, oh, I'm taking a class in African literature, you read Wole Soyinka, you read Chinua Achebe, right? But you won't typically read things written in Arabic or other African languages. Whereas on the continent itself, by far, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse and his poetry is way more popular than Soyinka ever could be, even in Nigeria. Now, kind of due to these similar reasons, scholars of Arabic and Islamic literary traditions have often assumed a kind of lack of an Arabic literary tradition in West Africa, or assumed it's the deficiency. So all these guys are Arabs, they're way out there in West Africa, so the Arabic probably isn't that good. Fortunately, this has been challenged even in the Arab world itself recently, even on the popular level. So there's this wonderful program I really like. It's kind of like American Idol, but for Arabic poetry. It's called Amir Shuara, so voters kind of vote in and put this. And every year for the past couple years, there's been a West African in the finals. And in 2019, Oludamini Ogunnaike from Senegal won the whole thing. And he beat the Arabs in the Arabic poetry competition. So even at the popular level, the incredibly high level of Arabic literary ability in West Africa is being recognized. And another thing that's led to the kind of under-representation of praise poetry in the scholarship, at least Europhone scholarship, has been that Arabic poetry is tough. It's tough to read, it's tough to translate, you kind of need some experience. And so it's been assumed to be a thing for the scholarly elite, not for the masses of West Africa who might not necessarily read Arabic literature. But as you can see in the videos, I mean, not everybody there is an expert in Arabic literature and prosody and things like that. You don't need to be in order to appreciate it. So this Arabic praise poetry is one of these places where the very highest levels of kind of the scholarly elite and the masses actually intersect the most. It's not just a thing for the scholarly elite. Some other issues that have, I think, made it hard for not just this kind of poetry, but Arabic panegyric praise poetry in general being appreciated is there's not really a kind of Western analogy to it. We don't have, like, praise poems aren't a big part of our culture. The closest things I could think of are like campaign ads, or like a biopic, like a movie about Lincoln, or maybe hymns, or maybe like when rappers sing songs about their mom and they're praising their mom or something like that. Like, that's kind of the closest thing. There's no real kind of genre equivalent, and I think that makes it harder to appreciate this kind of poetry. But anyway, despite the neglect in Europhone literature, this Madīḥ Nabawi poetry, particularly in Arabic, remains by far the most popular form of poetry in West Africa, and probably the most popular form of literature in both performance and study. So what I want to try to unpack in the rest of the lecture today is try to understand why. Why of all the different kinds of literature that are available, why is this what West Africans love to do, listen to, recite so much? Oh, I forgot, another reason why African poetry hasn't been studied as much is good old racism. This is from the 1970 Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, which says Negro poetry cannot be labeled poetry in the strict sense of the term. 1970. Okay, so before we dive into this world of West African Sufi poetry, you should heed the warning of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, one of the great luminaries of this tradition. It says, whoever approaches the poetry of the saints by grammar and prosody alone will suffer grave mistakes. Or in the words of Goethe, whoever wants to understand the poem has to enter the poet's land. So we have to understand a little bit about the kind of Sufi theories of language and poetry and how they understand how it works. So every single one of these poets that I've read has asserted either somewhere in their poems or somewhere else that poetry is an important means of spiritual cultivation. And this is one of the reasons why it's so popular, particularly in the Sufi orders. So poetry has been described in this literature as an echo of the Quran. It's beautiful, it has verses, it's very symbolic, just like the Quran. One poet even made the comparison. He said, just as nothing remains of prophecy but the true dream, this is a hadith, the saying of the Prophet, nothing remains of revelation but true poetry, since poetry speaks in the language of dreams, of symbolism. The composition of poetry, again, these poets regard the composition of poetry as being a really important part of their spiritual journeys. Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, who I mentioned before, the Senegalese Sheikh, who was a kind of, he's a national hero for his nonviolent resistance to French occupation. He wrote in one of his poems, I began to traverse the path of the people, that is the Sufis, the mystics, the moment I began to write his praises, that's praises of the Prophet. Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, I mentioned before, said, my poetry is my inheritance, the fruits of all the moments of my life, my traces, my trade, my weapons, and my fortress. So the composition of poetry is really important. It's a devotional act. And many of the poets decided, even though they could also write in other African languages like Wolof or Hausa or Fulfulde, they decided to write in Arabic because they wanted to praise the Prophet in his own language, as if they were seeing him right in front of them. And the function of this poetry you find numerous works with this title in West Africa, Taysir al-Wusul ila Hadarat al-Rasul, facilitating the arrival or union with the presence of the messenger. So that's what the poetry is supposed to do. Also, if any of you have ever written a poem, particularly a praise poem, you know it takes a lot of focus to write a good one. And if you're praising the object and not cursing the object of your poem, it engenders a lot of love. It comes from love and develops love. And this is precisely what these West African Sufis are trying to do. In fact, many of them have summed up the entire Sufi path for them is all just focus on the person of the Prophet and love for the Prophet. So poetry is a very strong tool for that. The recitation of the poetry is also important in spiritual cultivation because of this idea called lisan al-hal in Arabic, or tongue of the state. The idea that the spiritual, psycho-spiritual state of the poet is present in the poetry. Now this is, I mean, you can even see this in, like, I don't know, breakup albums. So somebody Adele breaks up with somebody, or Beyonce, this is something with Jay-Z. And in that state that she's in, she makes an album, sings these songs, and then you listen to it, and you start feeling the same way too. You get really mad at Jay-Z, or whoever did that to Adele, or, you know. So this lisan al-hal idea, but it's so much more so if these are people who have high spiritual stations and close spiritual proximity with the Prophet. They have a particular state of love and longing. They capture that in a poem, and then in reciting that kind of sets it free in the listeners as well too. The idea is also that the beloved who's described, in this case the Prophet, is also present in the poetry. So for example, while some people carry the Quran with them for its barakah, for safety on trips, other people carry descriptions of the Prophet, the idea being that a description of the Prophet carries something of the barakah, the sacred presence and blessing of the Prophet. The same is true of these collections of poetry in West Africa. People carry them on trips, people put them over babies when they're sleeping, because they're believed to carry the kind of barakah, the sacred presence of the Prophet, as well as the saints who love him. And this is part of what's called taking a term from another hadith, the licit magic, the sihr al-halal of poetry. Poetry is kind of almost like reciting these spells to, put people in a kind of trance of love for the Prophet, or another metaphor being alchemy. So poetry uses these combinations of sounds and letters and rhythms in order to produce joy, to produce something beautiful, to produce a beautiful work of poetry, which produces joy, cultivates love for the Prophet. And this is particularly important in the Islamic tradition and the Sufi tradition in general, because of these hadiths which say, none of you believe until I, the Prophet, am dearer to him than his mother, and his father, and his wealth and his children, and even himself. So how do you cultivate this kind of extreme sense of love? Poetry is a good way to do that. Also in the literature you see that poetry is prized as a means of spiritual cultivation because it's abiyat, it's verses, trains listeners to read the ayat, signs of the Quran, verses of the Quran, as well as ayat or signs in the world at large. So you see, poetry is a symbolic language, and it has multiple levels of meaning. So in a verse of poetry, you can write one thing and mean 10 things. And so this kind of way of symbolically reading, of drawing significance from things, of understanding connections between things, helps you read the Quran that way, and also helps you read the phenomenon in the world that way. Another related to this is this idea, you see Ibn Arabi, that's a famous Sufi that then gets repeated by authors in the region, that connects the etymology of the word for poetry, sher, which comes from the same root as the word sha'r, hair. And he said this is because everything in the world is connected by these subtle connections, raqa'iq, which are kind of like filaments connecting everything in the world. And what poetry does is it draws through its metaphors and images, it traces out these connections between these things. What does the sight of the beloved the face of the beloved have to do with the full moon, have to do with wine, with drunkenness, with all these subtle connections that poetry traces out. And these subtle connections are like hair-like in the filaments. So these are just some of the reasons why poetry is so important in spiritual cultivation in West African Sufi traditions. You can really see this though in this kind of what I call Sufi cosmopoetics, which is a strong tradition which considers the world, the entire world, as a poem. Right? So taking the metaphor, the image from the Quran and the Hadith of God speaking the world into existence. What is poetry but ordered speech? God creates the world, the Quran says, biqadrin, with measure, with order, with precision. And if the world is speech and ordered speech is poetry, then the whole world is a poem. Right? So Ibn Arabi says all of the world is endowed with rhythm, fastened by rhyme on the straight path. Basically, it's a poem. And so God speaking the world into creation, and then the world returns to him. So this kind of creation and return to God is often described by two arcs. So things come from haq, God the real, down to khalq, creation, and then return in another arc back to God. And this happens cosmologically. The world comes into being from God and then returns to him. Individually, we kind of come from God, born, live here for a little bit, die, return to God. This can also happen spiritually, in that we come down and then we can try to return to God before we get returned to God as well too. And this is where poetry kind of comes in. Many of the authors write about poetry and the process of composing poetry in imitation of the speaking the world into being as a way of ascending on this arc, as a way of returning to God before getting returned to God. So Sheikh Ibrahim Yas writes, all of the affairs of creation are from that mighty affair, either God or the prophetic reality. So my eye and my chest and my paper and my tongue and my pens and my ink, all of me is in service of his remembrance. By the remembrance of the messenger of God in this poetry, I'm exalted and elevated. So God kind of speaks the world into being as a poem, and then we can kind of echo that speech by writing our own poetry in praise of God and praise of the Prophet, and that will help us in our return. I'll skip this one. It's another lovely verse by Sheikh Madīḥ about the Prophet. He's all and all is from He, and this is true, for He chose him and granted him all this for all eternity. Each moment that I write for him my poetry, in this world and the next, I'm granted victory. All right, so it's not just Dr. Susi stringing things together so that it sounds nice. Okay, so now turning to the poetry itself. A very common theme that you'll see in the tradition of Madīḥ poetry, going back a very long way, is the impossibility of praise. That, okay, it's great to praise the Prophet, but this seems like an impossible task. So they take this hadith of the Prophet in which he says, God, I seek refuge in you from you. We cannot account your praises. God, you are as you praised yourself. And these poets apply that to the Prophet himself. So Ibn Farid has a beautiful verse in which he says, in the art of describing his beauty, the Prophet's beauty, time itself expires, and yet there still remains in him what has not been described. And Busiri, a famous poet, wrote the Burda, which is probably the most famous poem in the world, like ever, as a wonderful verse. The virtues of the messenger of God have no limit, so it cannot be expressed by human speech. And how in this world can his reality be comprehended by people sleeping, distracted by their dreams? There's another verse from his Hamziya poem describing this impossibility of praise. But the kind of classical formulation, one of my favorites, comes from the Andalusian poet Ibn Juzay, who says, I hope to praise the chosen one, the Prophet, but was turned back by my incapacity from attaining those feats. Even if I had the compass of the sea and the sea is overflowing, even if I had the counting of the grains of sand and the stars, if all my limbs became tongues, even then they would only reach some of what is desired in praising him. Even if all the worlds wrote his praise, they would not even reach some of what is required. I abstain from it out of awe and courtesy. And notice, he's saying I abstain from it while he's doing it. Right? It's out of awe and courtesy, and fear the tremendous difficulty of that exalted one. Perhaps there's eloquence in silence, and perhaps cause for approach in speaking. So one of the main ways in which the Prophet is praised is by saying, I can't possibly praise you, and so, but you're praising him while you do it. So it's some of these wonderful paradoxes that poetry allows or thrives on. Sheikh Madīḥ has a part of his very long, very famous Maulid poem echoes similar themes. How can I praise him when the entire cosmos is just a ray of his brilliance? How can I praise him when the seas and the rain are just a speck of his generosity? All knowledge is a drop from his river. God extolled him and bestowed everything on him. How can I praise Muhammad when he's the spirit of praise and the strongest of his praisers are exalted? How without rushing as an interloper amongst the crowds of praisers seeking gift? By the little we've offered you praise, and much is little compared to you, we are exhausted. It's no wonder that the best of the eulogizers languished in this field. The eloquent praised you, and the tongues all fell short of a tenth of your beauty. From the eloquence of Ka'b and Hassan, these were companions of the Prophet who also wrote famous poems in praise of him. To Imam Busiri, who wrote the Burda. All of that's but spittle coughed up out of longing, not worthy of your praise in the least, nor is that of the masters of rhetoric, and the weakness of my edition is like that of the eloquent. But your praise has not ceased, nay, it will never cease. Nay, speech would cease without attaining this excellency. Please accept, O my beloved, with all acceptance, the contrived poetry of a useless man. So this paradox that while praising the Prophet, they say we can't possibly praise you. And so how do you square the circle? How do you accomplish what can't be accomplished? How do you F the ineffable? Riffing off of the great Arab poet Mutanabbi, this Mauritanian poet, Al-Yadali, says, in order to praise the best of servants, I can only hope for help from his greatness. That is one of the miracles of the Prophet, is that he makes this impossible task of praising him possible for the poets. And in the book on this, I argue that another thing that kind of makes this possible, that makes effing the ineffable possible, is the barzakhi nature of poetry. Now, barzakh is a liminal reality that unites and separates two opposites. So we're coming up on sunset now. Sunset's a barzakh between night and day. You know, this door frame is a barzakh between inside and outside. And so if you're caught between silence, I can't possibly praise you, it's too much for language, and speech, but I can't stay silent because I'm so in love, I need to say something, what do you turn to? Poetry. Poetry itself has this kind of barzakhi quality. It's a barzakh between music and prose, between feeling and thought, or in Arabic, hal and qal, state, like psycho-spiritual state and saying, or adwaq, direct experiences, and awraq, papers, or literally like written expressions. And you see this in the very structure of poetry as well too. Rhythm in all classical Islamic poetry is strongly metered. Rhythm is a barzakh between eternity or stillness and time and motion. Rhyme is a barzakh between one sound and many sounds, and all classical Islamic poetry is rhymed. And the kind of stock of poetry, metaphor, is a barzakh, a bridge between the signified and the signifier. This is particularly apt in praising the Prophet because in the Sufi cosmology is understood as the barzakh, the liminal reality that unites and separates being and nothingness. And we as human beings are also barzakh between spirit and body. And the very medium of poetry itself is breath. And poetry's medium is, painters have a canvas, and as poets, the medium is breath. And breath is understood as a barzakh between the spirit and the body. So this barzakh nature is like what I say, understands, allows you to F the ineffable. Ibn Farid has a lovely verse here, or half verse, which he says, in illusion there's meaning not contained in plain expression. As you can say things in poetry, in elusive poetic speech that you can't say in straightforward prose. And the form of the poetry is important to this effect as well too. He writes in his famous Khamriya, his wine poem, the subtlety of vessels in reality comes from the meanings they contain, and these meanings are enhanced by their vessel's subtlety. And so the meaning and the form of the poetry aren't separate things. It's not just like the poetic form is not just like a Amazon package that you stuff the meaning in and send it out. They're inseparable in this understanding of things. Now, most of the West African poems are called qasidas, khasaid, and they all kind of roughly follow the classical qasida form in one way or another. It's been transformed a lot. Now, the qasida is a very, very old art form, predates Islam, and it's transformed into all kinds of different places, but the classical structure is this tripartite structure. Qasida begins with what's called a nasib, which is an amatory prelude in which the lover, the poet, stands at the ruins, the traces of the campsite of the beloved, and bemoans the passage of time. You know, I just missed my lover, the poles are still there, let's stop and cry. And they describe a kind of, this campsite is called the Atlal, the ruins of the campsite. And in this section, you see, they describe this kind of outer landscape, what they're looking at, but that outer landscape also corresponds to an inner landscape of the poet's feelings. So the most famous example of this is from the Borda. So is it from remembering the neighbors at Dhul Salam, which is an area outside Medina, that you mix tears with blood in crying? Or was it the winds that blew over the plains of Kadima, or the darkness, lightning flash in the darkness of Idam? These are all places around Medina. So you have the tears mingled with blood, you have lightning flashes, you have all this. So this combination of the description of the inner landscape and the outer landscape. So in the kind of Sufi versions of the Qasida, this names and describes the separation of farq, of separation from the divine beloved, or from the prophetic beloved. And the Atlal, which back in the day were just campsites of earthly beloved, and Qasidas praising the Prophet all become Medina, and the areas around Medina, or things related to Medina. Then the next section in the classical Qasidas that are here, the desert journey, which the poet sets out and faces all kinds of obstacles, scorpions, enemies, colds, hunger, in pursuit of the beloved. And in the transformations of the Sufi Qasida, this becomes the poet going through the various stages of the spiritual path, facing various difficulties, overcoming these difficulties, and corresponds to tariqah, the spiritual way, or suluk, spiritual wayfaring. And then the last section, traditionally is the Madīḥ section, which praises the beloved or praises the patron, and usually makes a request for gold, for money, for honor, other things like that, ransoming somebody. And in the Sufi Qasidas, they have requests for good health and other things like that, but typically the request is for union with the beloved Prophet. This is the stage of Haqiqah in the spiritual path. So I mentioned the Borda follows this pretty well. Sheikh Ibrahim Yas has a really interesting kind of 20th century updated version of this in this poem, where he takes the Atlal, his starting point was in Paris. So when he wrote this poem, he was actually coming back from Medina, and he stopped in Paris, and he was put in a hotel room above a discotheque, and there are all these lights. And so he said, oh, the lights and the castles and things, they remind me of my beloved back in Medina, how I miss him so much. And then for the Rahil section, he recounts his journey on the plane. And he says, oh, and I go through and so he goes back and forth between his journeying through the clouds and then journeying through the spiritual stations. And in the Madīḥ section, he describes the beauty of the Prophet, the beauty of the Prophet's Rawda, his tomb in Medina, and he says, I remember the days when I was sitting there in the Rawda, blissful and happy. I'll never leave it. Even if my body leaves it, I'll never leave the Rawda. I'll always be with him. And may you make this union good. So you see how this structure can get transformed in all kinds of interesting and creative ways, and continues to be up to this day. Now, another important thing going on with the Qasida, particularly the Madīḥ, the praise part of the Qasida, Qasidas and praise, is that it's a double portrait. What one scholar has called a double portrait. So a portrait is just any depiction of someone. You can depict someone with paint, or you can depict someone with words. And so a Madīḥ, Qasida Madh, a poem in praise of somebody is depicting them in words. But in depicting them in words, you're also depicting the poet's relationship with them. So you're also depicting your relationship with the person described. So this portrait expresses an intended relationship between the portrait image and the human original. The portraitist plays an intermediary role between the human subject and his image. And so you get this kind of double portrait. You get the poet portraying himself or herself, as well as, in this case, the prophet, at the same time. And this is particularly apt for members of these Sufi lineages whose kind of main goal, they see the goal of the spiritual path as establishing a close relationship with even identity and annihilation in the prophet. So you see here some double portraits here, and then it's one of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba here, which his whole body is made of a little bit of Quran and some of his poetry. And so Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse actually puts this explicitly in a verse. He said, if they were to depict me in reality, they would not see anyone save that beloved in whom we are delighted. Right, so in his poetry, if you were to see him, you'd actually just see the prophet. So this is the double portrait in action. All right, so the next, what I have left of the lecture, I want to describe kind of how this praise poetry works. So first and foremost, I have two little kids, and I spend a lot of my evenings singing lullabies to them to try to get them to go to sleep, to kind of produce a shift in their consciousness so I can do the things that I have to do. And the praise poetry, I argue, works in a very similar way. Just like the lullabies rely on rhythms and the melodies and the sounds in order to produce the desired shift in consciousness, praise poetry tries to do the same thing, except instead of put us to sleep, what praise poetry is trying to do is to awaken us to our best nature, which is identified with the prophet. Poetry also functions as kind of dua, as a supplicatory or petitionary prayer, as a kind of hilya or talisman, an icon, as a form of dhikr or invocation, as a mode of wujud, of being or consciousness, and as a kind of embodiment or representation of al-insan al-kamil, the perfect or complete human being. I'll try to go through these. So there are a number of, there's a hadith I found in these West African collections, but I haven't seen anywhere else, which is a tribute to the Prophet, which he says, anyone who composes praise of me, even if it's just one verse, I'll intercede for him on the Day of Judgment. So the composition of praise poetry is, whether you know it or not, an implicit request for intercession, dua. There are lots of others more widely attested hadith sayings about intercession, connecting it to praise. So sayings from Umar, one of the caliphs, saying that your du'as, your supplicatory prayers are suspended between heaven and earth until you praise the Prophet or invoke blessings upon the Prophet, and then they go up to God. Similarly, on a bunch of traditions about on the Day of Judgment, the Prophet will praise God with praises that nobody's ever heard before, nobody's ever said before, and as a result of those praises, he will be granted intercession to intercede for all of creation. So there's this tight connection in the Hadith literature between praise and intercession, and between praise and, I mean, even in ordinary relationship, you want something from someone, you're like, oh, it's so good to see you, you look so great today, can I get a ride? You know, that's how it works, even in ordinary human relationships. Attar, a Persian poet, has this wonderful verse that I think encapsulates what's going on here. What generous love his wisdom here displays, his part is mercy, ours is endless praise. So a number of poems in this tradition, these Madīḥ poems, are essentially just versified du'as. So you have some that are asking for good health, some that are asking for protection, just du'as asking for all kinds of things, but they're put in verse form, intermixed with praises of the Prophet. And for the sake of time, I'll skip that recitation. Now onto a hilya. So some of you may have seen these designs. Some are very popular in Turkey, but not just in Turkey. So you have these descriptions of the Prophet's features, written out in beautiful calligraphy. And these hilyas are really important. They serve kind of as icons. They serve a way for people to imaginalize, the Arabic word is tahyil, the features of the Prophet. And in fact, again, a saying attributed to the Prophet, but you don't find it in any of the canonical sources, says, or at least I haven't found it, "For him who sees my hilya after my death, it is as if he has seen me himself," so it's the Prophet speaking, "and he who sees it longing for me, for him God will make hellfire prohibited, and he will not be resurrected naked at doomsday." So this hilya is a very important way of making the presence, the spiritual presence of the Prophet present through a description of his physical features and his character. Sheikh Ramyas says the very same thing about his own poetry, most of which is described to praising the Prophet. "So my writings are a joy to mankind. Whoever sees me or my writing will not be miserable even for a day. I've not said this without permission, and I keep a secret not divulged by other than me." And all of this is from love of the Lord of the Messengers. Upon him be the blessings of God, and may his affair be elevated. So this process of tahyil, of imagining the form of the Prophet in order to achieve closer intimacy with him, you see in a number of these poems. So this is a famous one. Thanks. By Sheikh Ramyas as well. So he says, I might not be able to meet the Prophet, but at least I can remember him and imagine him in this way and have this kind of intimacy with him. There are numerous poems that are essentially versifications of the appearance of the Prophet as well too. One of the most famous of which, by Sheikh Ramyas, basically takes what you would see written on a hilya and puts it into qasida form. So it starts out with this nasib, lightning flashing in the meadows, and then moves to describing the Prophet in Medina.
ديار لأعلى الخلق خلقا وخلقة ديار لمن في خلق يعطي ويمنع وأكرمهم نفسا وصيرا ونباتا وعلما وأدبا وأرقى وأرشد فقد كان خير الخلق فخما مفخما وذو هيبة والمشي فيه تدلع.
So those poems actually, in fact that last one is sometimes prescribed by shuyukh to disciples in order for them to have a dream of the Prophet. So they say recite this every night before you go to sleep until you have a dream of the Prophet, because it describes his appearance so vividly. Now another way in which this poetry functions is as a form of dhikr. Dhikr meaning remembrance or mention, works basically with the idea that the invoked, the madhkur, is present in the invocation, the dhikr. And this dhikr invocation unites the invoker, the dhakir, with the madhkur. The most popular form of dhikr in West African Sufism by far is the Salat al-Fatih, running across Turuk, which is this prayer upon the prophets. And it's said in kind of, this prayer on the Prophet is said in response to the command in the Quran, "Verily God and His angels pour blessings upon the Prophet. O you who believe, blessing, pray for him a blessing very much." And so this form of dhikr, that takes a form of asking God to pour blessings or to pray upon the Prophet, is extremely popular in West Africa. It's kind of the backbone of a lot of spiritual training. And versions of it will find its way into the poetry as well too. And also, the poetry itself will often have this versified dhikr. But moreover, when it's recited, it's often recited in a kind of choral call and response way. Well, I'll play you an example here so you can see what I mean, of other forms of dhikr. So you have each, how do you say, each half of a verse praising the Prophet, and then the chorus, La ilaha illallah. So you have invocation of praise and blessings on the Prophet, and then an invocation of dhikr of La ilaha illallah. So you have kind of dhikr of the two shahadas back and forth.
والله.
I will skip this for a second. Oh. Or you have other, I can't skip this. This is my favorite one. So here the chorus is Allah, Allah, Allah. So you have praise of the Prophet interspersed with the dhikr of the name of God. Allah, Allah, Allah. This is by a contemporary Mauritanian poet. Rough translation. Loving Taha is delightful. How lovely is that great noble. He's the treasure of creation and to open us the doorway. And he's peace in our protection and he's food in our refreshment. He's a pearl and he's a treasure. He's the kernel and quintessence. A land without love of Taha is a wasteland so forsaken. And hearts without love of Taha are ruins wrecked and desolated. And in each of every heart is a portion of Taha's passion or passion for Taha. He is the soul's enchantment truly, and he is the answered prayer. No beloved can distract you from him, no hearts, no violence, the Arabic sort of out there. Without that, I don't care at all for any blessing or torment. And just keep going like that for hours and hours and hours. Allah, Allah, Allah. I'll skip this one for the sake of time. Okay, now to the heavy metaphysical stuff. So praise as beings. Madīḥ poetry is kind of an instantiation of being itself. So remember how we said how we take the metaphor of God speaking things, everything into existence. So this is a discussion that you find in Arabic, in which he says the reality of praise is the act of making God's attributes of perfection manifest. This can either be through words or it could be an act, which is like God's praise for himself and the praise of all things for him. So God's praise for himself is God existentiating, bringing out his qualities. And how does God bring out his qualities? By creating things. So God creates something which is long-lasting, or beautiful, or merciful. That is God bringing out his own qualities, so that's God praising himself. So everything that exists, God's existentiating act all of God's existentiating acts are acts of self-praise. And so the existence of everything is praise in the sense of making positive qualities known. Because God creating things is making his own positive qualities known through the reflection of his qualities and attributes in those things. Now, it says you can call every existent thing praise. So everything, the trees are praise, the houses are praise, the cars are praises, everything's a praise, and everything so too is a praiser. But the most exalted and the most tremendous level of praise is the Prophet Muhammad, called the best of all creation. Because the Prophet arrived at what's called the praiseworthy station, it's mentioned in the Quran. So his hallowed essence is the utmost level of praise through which God praises himself. So what is the creature, the creation, which best manifests, which best reflects God's names, attributes, and qualities? That's the Prophet Muhammad. So the existence of the Prophet is God's best praise of himself. This is why he says the Prophet has been singled out with the banner of praise. You see why he's called Hamid, Ahmed, why his name is Muhammad, meaning the praised. So the Prophet combines the best praiser, God, the best praise, the Prophet Muhammad, the best of creation, and the best praise back to God. So what I argue that the Sufi poets are doing here in writing Madīḥ poetry is that they're imitating this. In praising the Prophet, they're trying to in a certain sense, imitate what God is doing by praising the Prophet. Now, to quickly wrap up, the last thing that this poetry does is it describes the kind of perfection of human nature, the perfection of the human state, which is identified with the Prophet, and in certain Sufi discourses is identified with this idea of maqam la maqam, so the station of no station. So the idea is whatever high spiritual station you attain, by virtue of it being a station and not another station, it's still limited. Right? And so the perfect ones, like the Prophet Muhammad, have attained this kind of station of no station. They've gone beyond any kind of limitations whatsoever. They're completely undelimited. And so this is the actual essence and perfection of human nature, is to not be bound by any limitation whatsoever, just like God is not bound by limitations. I don't have time to get too into it, but it shows up in the poetry in lots of really interesting ways as well too. There's a quote here from Sufi describing what it's like to kind of be in the station of no station. Where basically the bonds are loosened, the contingent properties, states, attributes, stations, configurations, acts, and belief. He, the one who is in the station, is not confined by any of them. By his essence, he flows in everything, just as wujud, being of consciousness, flows in the realities of all things, without end or beginning. Okay, so sorry to have to skip through all this. Okay, go to the conclusion. All right, so Madīḥ poetry is meant to and describes, embodies, invokes, evokes, and provokes non-delimited human perfection in its wedded forms and meanings. It functions as a form of dua, petitionary prayer, as a kind of hilya, as a kind of icon to allow for takhil, imaginalization of the Prophet, as a form of dhikr, remembrance or invocation, as a kind of mode of wujud, being as praise, and it's meant to describe and kind of cultivate the perfection of human nature, the completeness of human nature. It mimics or echoes God's praise for himself in the person of the Prophet and embodies this in verse. And this verse is really important, the verse part. It's part of the magic of poetry. The form of it is important. The rhymes, the meters, the sounds. It works kind of like a lullaby. It works kind of like this lisan al-hal. It captures a state and it sets it free. It provokes desire and love for the beauty of humanity. And the Prophet in this cosmology is not considered just the best of humanity out there, but the best within each and every person and within each and everything. And the formal beauty of the poetry is central to its efficacy in kind of evoking this beauty of humanity within each person. So, in kind of conclusion, this poetry, it's really important. You can't divorce the devotional and the literary dimensions of this poetry. As sometimes scholars like to go say, oh, this is devotional, this is a religious thing, oh, this is literary, this is aesthetic. Those two can't really be considered separately, at least in this genre of literature. I won't say anything about the hypertextuality. I'll just leave with this note by William Chittick, who I think accurately describes this idea of human perfection that you see reflected in the poetry. In a certain sense, all genres of literature assume a kind of genre of human being that's reading it, assume a kind of reader that they're written for. And Madīḥ poetry really is addressed to the Prophet. And so the genre of humanity, the audience that it has, is the prophetic reality within each and every human being, which is the best of humanity, which is this non-delimited human nature. So William Chittick says that modern intellectual currents, the media, popular culture, make people feel comfortable with the false notion that they belong to fixed stations, that you're this, you're not that. Once people lose sight of the non-delimitation of the true human state, which is that which is described and kind of evoked in this poetry, they lose the possibility of thinking about perfection, much less achieving it. Modern knowledge can tell us who we are not. It can never tell us who we really are. Only a perspective, or I would argue poetry, rooted in the station of no station, can show us the way to this central point. Thank you very much for bearing with me. If you want to learn more, you can check it out in this book.